Jason, for hour two, where do you want to go?
Well, we can talk about the tall ones. You mentioned the anthropology. You were asking me about, evidence of anything outside the ordinary, and you're talking about artificial intelligence and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing that I like to be clear on with any audience is that my knowledge of this topic involves discoveries that have been made east of the Mississippi River, and that is going to be in our first book. And the second book is also going to include research that we have done, some of it in Canada and on the Pacific coast, the Aleutian Islands, and California. And the reason I like to specify that is I want people to understand the regions that I'm referring to when I make these types of descriptions, because I don't want to sound like I'm generalizing for the whole planet.
Right.
So from an anthropological perspective, we can learn a lot about these people, and basically what we know is this. Many of them were of extraordinary height, especially considering the average height of the people who buried them. Their bones were often very thick. They also practiced artificial cranial deformation, and this cranial deformation is not the same cranial deformation that we see in the Paracas culture of Peru, and I just like to note that because some writers have confused these two cultures together, and they are not the same people or culture.
I'm glad you clarified that. Yeah.
Yes,
they're
do. They're not the same people.
Mm-hmm.
The most anomalous feature of many of these skeletons is in the dental abnormalities. Sometimes they have less teeth than humans living today, and sometimes they have more. But in the hardcore anthropology, there is no record that I'm aware of here in the Ohio Valley of a full double or triple set of teeth, as some people have reported. In all likelihood, the old accounts from the 1800s that mentioned double rows of teeth were people who noticed perhaps several extra teeth and simply blew the story out of proportion.
Is that right? Wow, I hear that all the time about that.
You are going to hear it. You'll continue to hear it. But in many instances, it turns out, and this is just what we know that has been professionally documented, that in many instances, the old copper, red ochre, and Adena people, the crania in their tombs may have, one extra tooth, or in some instances less teeth than modern humans. But, this was not a case where you have some type of monster with double rows of teeth. That is a fiction that has grown out of the sensational way that some people in the 1800s reported these discoveries.
I'm so glad that you're talking about this, because I can't begin to tell you how many people I've even interviewed that have discussed that about the rows of teeth. So
sure.
That's very important. That's very critical data right there.
Well, there is one instance of a person with double rows of teeth in the upper jaw, but this is something that happens even today. There are some people among our population today who are born to develop that. But there is only one instance that has been professionally documented that I'm aware of, and it comes from a much more recent burial of a person of average height. So I hope that sheds some light on that question.
Oh, it certainly does. Yeah, well, there's so much exaggeration when it comes down to what's going on with the giants and the illusion of the giants. I know that's what I like about you is that you keep it pretty real. You keep it very articulate insofar as your historical benchmarks, and that's very, very important. A lot of people are out there and they're just saying all kinds of stuff right now about giants, and and we all want to look on that level of obviously we're multidimensional and we can look on a higher level of consciousness to see about other species, but it is nice to hear this tonight. It really is.
Well, if you want to see an ancient people's level of perception of higher levels or alternate dimensions, all you need to do is look at their cosmology, not their physical anthropology.
Right.
The Native Americans preserved plenty of lore that shows us how perceptive they were to the realm that we live in, because I believe it is a realm. And we don't really have to look at physical remains to see that. They had an incredible cosmological scheme that was handed down from mound builder times.
I agree.
And there's going to be a chapter in the book that's about to come out. Chapter 16 is about the cosmology of these people. And I'm writing about that a lot more in the future, too, because it's an endless subject of fascination.
Right.
One of the common explanations for the discovery of the large skeletons that some archaeologists use is that the bones were pressed out of shape by the earth, as they were in the tomb, and people just thought they were giants when the Smithsonian dug them up in the 1800s. But in our book, we have a particular discovery in Ohio of one of these skeletons where the Smithsonian agent wrote in his own journal that he measured the length of the skeleton by the femur. So they were definitely measuring the skeletons. They weren't just viewing the skeletons and coming up with an inappropriate size.
Right. That makes a difference right there.
Right. And something else I like to point out as well, my goal is to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And if that evidence leads me somewhere that's less sensational than some people would like, then it's just the way it's going to have to be.
I think that's great.
The tall ones in North America, for all intents and purposes, they lived and died like human beings. Their bones are the bones of human beings. They disintegrated like the bones of human beings, or were partially preserved like the bones of human beings. They didn't live to be 500 years old. They had the same death rate as other people in their local groups. They ate white-tailed deer and gourd and pumpkin and probably some corn. They were a hunter-gatherer people with an extraordinary culture, and I believe personally that they were hunter-gatherers because they chose to be. I don't think they saw the wisdom in a sedentary lifestyle. And I think that's true for a lot of ancient American cultures. I was just reading a study the other day about how the Neolithic revolution in Europe, which used to be considered the source of all these great breakthroughs in how we live, actually destroyed the health of the population. In a lot of ways, a hunter-gatherer lifestyle is preferable to what we've developed today.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what's very concerning. Just seeing the world the way it is today and how hostile it is, how backwards it's becoming. Not everywhere, but it seems to me that the mainstream and the norm and the illusion of the norm is literally just going backwards and going in reverse in their own evolution, and that's very concerning. They're just there's no benchmark of the cosmic design anymore within their own DNA. It just seems like it's being erased.
Sure. Well, one of the biggest problems, I believe, and I just want the audience to know, I recognize that whatever I say is my opinion. This is my interpretation of history, and I'm not one of those researchers who expects everybody to agree with everything I say. In fact, I really appreciate it when people question the things I say and look into it on their own, because that's when breakthroughs happen. But really, to address what you just said, we need to ask ourselves, what is civilization? What is civilization? Today, in academia, the first recognized civilization is considered to be that of ancient Uruk in Mesopotamia. Well, the Uruk civilization, as it's called, emerged around 3500 BC. Now, a study of ancient Uruk and what destroyed it has a lot to teach us about living in America and Europe today. First of all, what they call the first civilization, ancient Uruk, was actually an expansion a colonial expansion from southern Mesopotamia that reached Iran, the Caucasus Mountains, pre-dynastic Egypt, Turkey, and Syria. And the empire was built on a form of colonialism by which representatives from Uruk gradually incorporated and took over local economies. Mm-hmm. And the capital of this world system, Uruk, became the first large city, and the city ruled over an international organization of human labor. And a lot of people are unaware that cuneiform script, which is considered the first form of writing, emerged at this time, and cuneiform was actually invented to keep track of the debt of the citizens. Mm. It was not invented to tell the tales of great heroes or gods. It was invented because the government needed a way to keep track of the distribution of wealth, resources, and goods in every level of society. Mm-hmm. And the group who controlled the distribution was the temple priesthood. And so, you know, to be the world's first civilization, the Uruk world system is actually an ancient form of the Federal Reserve Bank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And now, interestingly enough, working under the temple, the next tier down in authority in Uruk, was a group of leaders consisting of hundreds of bureaucrats who governed every aspect of human labor on behalf of the elite. They controlled every profession, whether it be farming, pottery making, or metallurgy. Every profession was specialized and segregated and controlled and regulated by the central power. Mm-hmm. And the Uruk world system ultimately collapsed because they had an ecological collapse due to their big agra processes, which were identical to ours, with the exception that we have GMOs to make things worse. And also because the gap between the haves and the have-nots was catastrophic, mm-hmm. very similar to how things seem to be going today.
Right.
So to serve as a model for the first civilization, it's no wonder that once we come out of the halls of academia in the United States, we just begin to perpetuate a system that really doesn't work for the people, because the model that we're using did not work for the people all those thousands of years ago either.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Same old repetitive cycle, and it's self-destruct. There's nothing positive about it, in my opinion. Just like a carousel that never stops, you know?
Well, in my opinion, a civilization would be a way of life in which human beings are permitted to thrive. Mm-hmm. And until I see something like that, until I see that model emerge, I fail to see how we could consider anything civilized.
Right. You know, that's a good point you make right there, because the quality of life for the average bear, the average person, in my opinion, is not very good. I don't care. It really isn't. When you think about the contamination factor on all levels, it's not good. It's an existing, not a living. You know, people exist, they don't live.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very true. I mean, I think that people are experiencing a yearning for something different, which is one reason why people look back at the ancient cultures. Mm-hmm. We're looking for meaning in something other than the contemporary with the way things are now. And there's nothing wrong with that, really. When I began to study the Tall Ones, I was determined to learn as much as I possibly could about their culture and way of life. A lot of the book that we're about to release is going to teach people about how they organized their settlements and how their societies were organized, you know, what they ate. Mm-hmm. And the reason we're doing that is to show the human element, but also to show people that there are different ways of doing things, you know. Mm-hmm. The culture which has produced the most gigantic skeletons anywhere in the world was located here in the Ohio Valley. It's known as the Adena culture. So the Adena are a constant topic in all the press and all the various media about the so-called ancient giants. And what you gather from a lot of the stuff that's out there is that, well, these giants, they must have been overlords, or, you know, they were Nephilim that were ruling over the people. But what we actually see in the archaeological record is that their societies were usually heterarchical. Mm-hmm. And a heterarchical society is one in which people have certain social roles that are roles with certain associated prestige and symbols, but the roles only become activated when they're needed. And the people who fulfill those roles do not have lasting power over the rest of the people in the community. Mm-hmm. And so what we see throughout all of human history really is sort of a scale between that type of society, very ancient form of society, and hierarchy. And all of us in our lives are faced with choices which tip that scale one way or another between heterarchy and hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. Right. You know, and I was going to ask you a quick question here. It might dovetail into some of the things you were talking about, but, you know, when you talk about the historical benchmarks of some of these different people and species, what about the celestial skies insofar as the connection between the sacred mounds and the correlation to any type of constellation? Because really what you're looking at on that level, if there is something there, that is really what we're talking about. It is the keys and components to who we are as cosmic beings on a timeline or on a world.
Mm-hmm. Sure. This is one of my favorite subjects. So I should be clear that most of the insight that I have to offer on the cosmology of the mound builders, mm-hmm. Most of my insights come from the study of several brilliant archaeologists. You know, there are still some archaeologists who are philosophers, whether they realize it or not. And so I'd like to cite George Langford, Christopher Carr, Robert Mainfort. These people have had a profound impact on how I think about mound builder cosmology. Mm-hmm. And so what I believe the evidence tells us is that these people perceived the cosmos as a three-tiered system. There was an Earth disk, which is our world. Below the Earth disk was a below realm or an underworld, and above the Earth disk was the celestial or upper realm. Now, the conical mounds, usually associated with burials and earthworks, the conical earth mound represented the axis mundi that connected all three realms. So, to bury your dead inside the axis mundi, you were transitioning them from the earth disk into one of the other realms. And there are a wonderful series of tablets that were made from stone or clay that were found in the mounds of the Adena. These are known as the Adena tablets. And they feature a lot of wonderful images of humans or symbolic glyphs or animals. And a common theme on these tablets is a bird or a birdman who's kind of perhaps flying on the axis mundi or world tree. So we know that in the vision quests of their shaman or spiritual leaders or priests, that they were traversing the realms of the cosmos. They were visiting other realms beyond the Earth disk, mm-hmm. probably the upper realm. Right. And so there was a real focus on the connection between this world and the above and below realms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, it seems like they were definitely more in tune to that type of a multidimensional perspective or state of consciousness versus what's going on today. And I think that's kind of sad because, you know, coming from beings like us, a lot of us have done the spiritual work to some degree where we are already kind of merged with those levels of consciousness. But when you look at the regular person on the street. It just, they're like I said, it seems to me it's a missing link right now, and it's huge because we need that to recreate ourselves on a higher dimensional space. If that makes sense at all.
Oh, it makes perfect sense to me. I mean, there's a reason why, some of the people who I've met in my lifetime who take their faith the most seriously are Catholics, and that's because to the Catholic, the symbols of the faith, which ignite the imagination and the soul, are surrounding them every day.
Right.
And that's also why in the Christian tradition, if you look at Europe, going back hundreds of years, the cathedrals often had carvings not only of saints, but of even mythological creatures.
Mm-hmm.
To enter a cathedral was to enter the realms described in Scripture or spoken of.
Right.
And so what we've done is we've secularized everything. We've transformed ourselves from a mythic consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And I still believe that the keys and components are within at the cellular level. So all of these beautiful structures, as nice as they can be, still they're not a representation of what we really are as multiversal, multidimensional beings. It's more of an exterior symbolism. And you made a good point, too, about the cathedrals. To me, they are like portals. They open up their own ritualistic portals through their own belief systems. And it's just a spin-off on a lot of different levels of even paganism to some degree, even though a lot of people in the Christian areas and religions might disagree, but it really is a spin-off of paganism.
Oh, sure it is. Let me say this, as a person who considers themselves a Christian, there are plenty of things from the ancient world that were associated with paganism that are true. And what I mean by that is just because people lived a certain way and those people had a different belief system than you do or I do does not invalidate any of the practical aspects of their way of life. When I look back, I'm one of those rare people who I consider myself to have a spiritual faith, but I can also accept what's in the archaeological record.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for that is I choose not to draw a line in my consciousness or my mind between the two. The barriers that we erect inside of our own consciousness, we can tear those down ourselves. We just simply have to choose to stop believing that they're there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, it's pure energy. When it boils down to it, it's energy, it's consciousness. I always keep it very simple in the illusion of, the religions are nice and they're benchmarks and they're stepping stones, but in my opinion, it's just about progressing to levels of higher consciousness through spirituality. That's for me anyway.
Sure. And at the end of the day, I think that all of us the questions that we need to ask are not whether or not the next person believes the same thing I do. The questions we should be asking are, can I coexist with this person?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because there are ideologies in our world, I'm sorry, that simply cannot coexist.
Mm-hmm. And we know which groups those are. Yeah.
They exist.
Mm-hmm.
It is an unfortunate fact of life.
Mm-hmm.
It is uncomfortable. It's not particularly inspiring.
It's oppressive. The bottom line is, I can use Islam as a perfect example, but yeah, there are certain things that just don't mesh. It's oil and water.
And the question is, do we or do we not desire a free and open society?
Mm-hmm.
And no conception of the world that insists that human beings be the property of other human beings can coexist with a free and open society, in my opinion.
I agree. I totally agree with you. And that's why, once again, you're seeing America here in a situation where we could keep going forward and ascend and keep moving on and growing and evolving, or we can go in reverse and literally go back into the dark ages through, all of these ideologies and everything else that's been happening here.
Sure. Well, I mentioned ancient Uruk before. I encourage everyone to research the Uruk expansion because this is the oldest civilization and therefore the first failed civilization, and it failed for behaving exactly as we are today.
Mm-hmm.
So if all the things we're doing are progressive, why are they so very old? And if they're destined to make us better, why did they fail 6,000 years ago?
Great point you make right there. Even their belief systems with their religions, literally. It's the same old thing.
The religion is the same old thing, and here's how. The elites in ancient Uruk justified their rule by claiming that they alone had contact with the gods. And today in America, we're taught that at least in America's churches, there's an emphasis on a piece of scripture, Romans 13, which teaches that God places rulers in power. And so we should therefore be completely subservient to the whims of our rulers.
Mm-hmm.
So how is that any different than the divine right of descent that we see in the pagan world?
Exactly. Yeah. That's very true right there. It's once again, it's always about bottlenecking information, whether it's through spirituality or ritual or religion or whatever. Technology, it's the same old game.
If you want to see where we're going if we do not radically alter our course, and I believe we are going to change course. I believe the course is changing now.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to see the natural outcome of the progressive path, look at ancient Uruk.
Yeah.
When their civilization collapsed, thousands of people disappeared overnight, and even in archaeology, we can't decide where they went.
Mm.
Their settlements were burned to the ground in many cases, and entire cities were abandoned. So you can imagine what happens when authoritarianism reaches its ultimate destination.
Right. And there was no remnant, no skeletons? What?
Well, there are skeletons. What we now know, and this may be another lesson, what we now know is that about the same time their society collapsed, there was a mass migration into Central and Western Europe of new people. And the new people who migrated en masse into Europe committed genocide against the Neolithic inhabitants. They killed them all off.
Mm-hmm.
They completely replaced them genetically and culturally, and those are our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened probably was that the people scattered far and wide, and this has all been backed up with recent DNA tests done on Indo-European remains dating from the time period. And it's very interesting because most scholars are coming around to understanding that this collapse of ancient Uruk is the historical event that's being described in the book of Genesis, known as the Tower of Babel, which the scriptures say that when they stopped building the tower, the people were scattered abroad upon the face of the earth.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Very interesting. Well, you are seeing some kind of a parallel here, in my opinion, in the United States. It seems like there's an eradication program going on, and the original, I wouldn't say indigenous, but the people who are the true Americans seem to be a kind of a endangered species. Some degree.
Well, there is the problem. I think one of the problems that we have is that our country does have a history of wrongs. But the issue is those wrongs are being used to try to convince us that we should self-annihilate.
Right. And the grass isn't greener on the other side. That's the problem. The grass is not greener with their vision.
When we surrender control of our society over to the state, it will result in a complete scorched earth system.
Mm-hmm.
The state cannot perfect people. Unfortunately, human beings are imperfect by nature, and living with imperfect human beings is the price of freedom. So it's really a matter of choosing whether or not we want to pay the price of freedom. Personally, I would pay the price for freedom. Mm-hmm. I would rather live in a world of uncertainty than live in a world of certain bondage.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Live free or die, isn't that the motto? Literally.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I certainly don't play the game of being controlled and manipulated. I think we've been through enough manipulation on many different levels. And yeah, I'm a free spirit. And you have to look at it on the cosmic design level. It's really about multiversal mastery, and also being free will, honoring free will, which is freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and freedom of how we want to live our lives while we're here. So, raising the bar.
That's right.
At least for me it is, yeah.
I think that most human beings, actually at the core level, a lot of human beings want the same things.
Mm-hmm.
Our problem, and to me this is one of the biggest problems, just from a cultural standpoint, Terence McKenna, the great American philosopher Terence McKenna, once said that a shaman was a person who stood outside of culture. He understood that culture was a sham. And we can stand outside the two-party system in this country and recognize it as a sham. It is a sham. Today, we have the emergence of what's being called the alt-right and the alt-left,
mm-hmm.
which these two forms of right-wing and left-wing are consuming, they're subsuming and absorbing the truth movement.
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing many voices who used to be truthers are now on the alt-right,
mm-hmm.
And at the same time, the alt-left is further radicalizing people who would otherwise be middle-of-the-road liberals.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So these are not organic products of our political debate. I believe that both the alt-right and the alt-left are being engineered to absorb the awakening.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Very well said, Jason. Yeah.
If we're going to have progress, we have to walk away from both,
mm-hmm.
and we need to walk away together.
Exactly.
Whichever
well, that's what I mean.
That.
It's a breakaway society. That's what I'm looking at. It's literally taking that group of people that you're talking about, the ones that are in between the spaces of all this craziness, and going to the next level.
Yes. And the first thing that we can do ourselves is to realize our own potential and to discover what our true passions are, because usually that's where your way of serving your fellow man is going to be found.
Mm-hmm.
And don't wait for the institution to give you permission or a license to do it. Just do it. Learn it, become it, and do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because the institutionalization and the overregulation of our roles in society are exactly what have led us to where we are today. And with the emergence of the new left and right wing, we have to be vigilant, and I think it's time to denounce both.
Mm-hmm.
Because, it's amazing how after the 2016 political season, all of a sudden the two-party system was back with a vengeance.
Mm-hmm.
I know that a lot of people believed and still believe that the two-party system is dead, but it isn't. It is not dead. It has morphed into the alt-right and the alt-left.
Yep.
And we need to make sure that we ourselves are not absorbed by that.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And if you notice, there's so much going on insofar as craziness from day to day. We kind of touched on that before. Just these, for example, the Vegas shooting. Okay, I can use that as an example. But all these things that are starting to happen here within the United States, which technically should not be happening, and in my opinion, have been engineered specifically.
Well, I am not one of those people who sees a conspiracy everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I usually, more often than not at this point in my life, I find myself being the person who's kind of trying to convince people not to see a conspiracy everywhere. But that does not mean that they don't happen.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
It's really simple. To me, it's the logistics. When I look at an event like Virginia Tech or Vegas, and I see a person who I'm told was just a person who snapped, like a random person who snapped and decided to do this, when I see that person handle the weaponry that they supposedly did and execute an event of the magnitude that they did with the planning they did with absolutely no history of any type of military training or background,
mm-hmm.
that's when I start to ask questions, because it's a logistical issue. It's very simple.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to look for videotapes of the event and comb over hours and hours of footage. We just need to look at the logistical side of it, which should have, in my opinion, should have a lot of people asking questions.
I totally agree. But, you know, I've worked casino surveillance, and I can tell you point blank, a lot of people are wondering where all the media is, you know, the footage is. They're not going to give you that information. They're not going to show you the footage. That's for law enforcement or, you know, alphabet agencies. It's not going to go to mainstream. It's never going to happen. So even if they could capture that, and I'm sure they have plenty of footage of him and whoever else he was interacting with, and, you know, we know the technologies of the government and the illusion of, and we understand very clearly what they're capable of doing. So, you know, I think you make some very good points with that. I really do. So, like I said, there's no such thing as an accident in the illusion of. You notice how I always say in the illusion of, because that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a construct of energy. And it is what it is. But in the moment, it's a construct that's been created by someone or something. And most of the time, it's through some of these agencies or some of these industrial complexes.
Well, I do know that looking at the history of the world, elites since the days of Uruk and since the Bronze Age chiefs rose up in Europe in the 3rd millennium BC, they have always wanted to control weapons and weapons technology.
Mm-hmm.
It is impossible to regulate any level of society without a certain level of control of weaponry and the distribution of the metals and goods that create weaponry. So, you know, if we were living in a society where people with power did not want to control the distribution of weaponry, i.e. guns, it would be the only instance in world history where they have not wanted to control it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Very true indeed. Yeah, and guns are nothing compared to some of the other technologies they have, you know, with the, you know, you're talking about mind control early on and some of the things they can do with artificial intelligence and synthetic telepathy, which I'm very familiar with, psychotronic weapons and covert brain hacking. I mean, all of these people, any of these targeted people, or for example, that shooter supposedly, I mean, literally, he could have been brain hacked. Anything can happen. Anything can happen here. So, and that's another thing. That's a weaponization of the world, which is about control. It's always been about control. And when you talk about, you know, being your own boss and your own spiritual being and doing what you're guided to do on the timeline, I think that's a really big deal. There are a lot of parties that once you start accelerating and start moving into that position on the chessboard, will try to take you down, literally.
Well, the way I look at it is, you know, I hear a lot of stuff about technology and things like that. I've read a lot of books about the subjects you're talking about. And, you know, just remember, any time that the system develops a type of technology which can be used to harm people, it's because some person who should have been drawn from among the population by fate or God or chance or whatever you want to call it was not doing it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The role was handed over to be institutionalized. The institutionalization of human labor and productivity is really what makes all this possible, you know. And
very true.
I think that the sooner we become scholars and the sooner we discover where our true passions are and discover what our purposes are, and the sooner we start doing those things only to help one another, we will effectively depower the forces that would like to do us harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. Disempowering them would be a good idea. Well, that's what you're doing. You're following exactly what you're needing to do here on the timeline, and that's what's supposed to be happening. Instead of getting distracted, and I must say, you know, being on the internet, it's a love-hate relationship because there's a lot you can access here, and there's an awful lot that's just plain garbage, you know. So once again, you have to use discernment when you're on the internet, but it is about that. It is about doing what you're guided to do. Go ahead.
Just using the giants as an example, I can tell you that 90% of what's on the internet is garbage.
Oh, I bet. And I see it all the time. You know, I see people putting all this stuff out there, and, you know, I have experience. That's where my data stream comes from, not from Googling. So that's the difference. You know, my books were written without being on the internet. Okay, let's just put it that way. So, yeah, it's very, very interesting to see how this is. It's like monkey see, monkey do. And that's the whole thing with these, even with cases that happen, even with the shooting in Vegas. Everybody and their mother's trying to troubleshoot it. Well, they're not, first of all, some of them aren't even qualified. Some are okay. But some don't understand how to decode certain things. And everybody's running with data that's not even accurate. So I'm stepping myself out of things. I'm kind of moving and navigating as the spy bird right now, because in order to progress, as you were touching on, we have to get beyond the distractions. And I'll tell you what, I've never seen so many distractions hitting us nonstop. I can't get over it. Now we have another hurricane. Was it Nate? So, I mean, it's just every time we turn around, boom, 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 boom. It's rapid fire.
Well, my advice to everyone who wants to make a difference is start the change within yourself. Educate yourself. That's where the change has to start. It does not matter how much data we can gather on any event or any subject if we haven't equipped ourselves with the knowledge and tools that we will need in order to make a difference once we have something to say about it. And always remember, this remarkable tool at our fingertips that we call the internet was originally invented to distract us.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
If we're going to use it, we must do so with discernment.
I agree.
For everything that happens in the world, there is an astonishing amount of information on the internet that is utterly false. Mm-hmm. And but how does a person look through that information? They look through that information by educating themselves on the subject.
Exactly. And also their own personal experience, which, of course, there's such a thing as world experience. To some degree.
Absolutely.
We should pay attention to that more often instead of following the horde. That's the problem that we're running into, is everybody's following each other, and it's they're kind of just going down the wrong spiral.
Well, some of the greatest learning experiences of my life have been, I've done several conferences at Serpent Mound in Ohio and presented on the Adena culture and the tall ones and various subjects. And usually at these events, you have the opportunity to meet a lot of different types of people. And I've met several archaeologists there, and I've also met several more New Age type people. And, some of the greatest learning experiences of my life have been just sitting around talking with these people, after or before a presentation. Mm-hmm. So experience will always be the best teacher.
Yeah, real conversation instead of bickering. Have you noticed that's all they do on mainstream media is bicker and argue and attack and attack and attack? They attack the truth with a lie, and they think they're equal to the lie or the truth. It's insanity, and it's just like a spiral of weird.
Well, there's a reason for that, and the reason is that mainstream media is not there to convince you of anything. I'm going to say that again. Mainstream media, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, none of these organizations exist to convince you of anything or to convince anyone else. They exist to show you people like yourself fighting with people who are different than you, so that you will then repeat that pattern ad nauseum every day. Mm-hmm. These organizations exist to give you a model of behavior that you're expected to then replicate. And by replicating that, we remain at odds with one another. Earlier I mentioned that alliance formation was integral to a productive and free society. Mm-hmm. The mainstream media model is one way by which this process is sabotaged.
Yep. It's negative entrainment. Really is.
Precisely.
Yeah, no good. And of course, once again, it's the same thing with the mainstream media insofar as not the mainstream media, but the entertainment industry. It's things you're seeing that's going out and spinning out of control in Hollywood. So, very strange, weird world.
Well, in ancient America, the mound builders, by around, let's say around 100 BC, in the Ohio Valley, were building platform mounds. They were platform-shaped earthworks and mounds, and they were preserving their traditions and their cosmological beliefs by probably a type of a ritualized series of plays on these mounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, it must have been successful because we see the cosmology that really started with the Adena around 1000 BC persist all the way up to the time of European contact with the people of the Mississippian culture. So we know that creating sort of plays and dramas and recreations of our mythology is a great way to preserve a cultural heritage, but at the same time, it could also be used to destroy a cultural heritage, and that is what the entertainment industry is being used for today.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's weaponized, without a doubt.
It is an inverse or reverse way of using the same principle that the ancients were using here, and for negative purposes.
Yeah, total inversion. There's no doubt about that. It's interesting, with all the centuries we've been around in the illusion of mankind, you have structures, lots of ancient structures, sacred sites, but what's really there besides the structures themselves?
There's memory, because human beings have a genetic memory, and it's a mystery that if it has been cracked, then it's not being shared yet, or perhaps it's not yet understood. But it's very interesting to go back and look at some of the things that the earliest Americans who saw the mounds and earthworks in North America thought when they saw them. Because when they saw the mounds and earthworks, they would write about them, and their theories back then, which they didn't have the tools we have today. They did not have the excavation techniques or radiocarbon dating. They did not have the ability to test metal like we do, or DNA. But when they saw the mounds and earthworks in the Ohio Valley, they made a lot of assumptions about what they were for and the things that happened at these earthworks. And what's interesting is most of their assumptions actually are accurate for similar structures in Europe, although they are inaccurate for the mounds here in North America. So the site of these structures had triggered a genetic memory from their own ancestors.
That makes perfect sense.
And so the ancient sites around the world, they're all very special because they resonate with us on a certain level. You're talking about standing monuments to the history of mankind. It's like our own book written on the landscape of the earth.
Exactly.
And that's one reason why I do not advocate. I was contacted by a Hollywood producer last year who wanted to do a documentary on the tall ones, and the reason I dropped out was they wanted to excavate several mounds looking for one of these skeletons, and I do not believe in desecrating any more of the ancient sites. I believe that we've excavated enough burials that we can know enough about their culture and who they were without desecrating any more graves.
Right. Yeah.
And in my opinion, all the ancient sites are of similar value because, like I said, they're the written book of humanity's history across this world.
Yeah, it's the only thing that's really still there. Think about it. In 100 years, 200, 300 years, who knows what's going to be here in the illusion of America, right? Or any other continent or country.
That's correct, depending on how the tide of history goes. But I do believe, if I was going to make a prediction, and I don't make predictions very often, but I think that we're going to see a lot of things from the past restored to our culture. I think people are kind of looking for a renaissance of ancient wisdom right now. Like as our roles as healers and philosophers and thinkers were taken from us by the system over the last century or so, people are looking back at like, well, what do we have before? What were we using to heal before? How were we building things before? And I think that the ancient European societies and the traditions of the Native Americans are going to provide a lot of insight and key aspects of that.
That'll be nice. Well, what I see? I see a lot of strange, chaotic stuff happening here in the United States, potential wars, and a surge and eventually probably what you're talking about, a renaissance of some kind, but I think it's going to be a struggle. And I'm hoping that's not the case. I really am, but I'm seeing such division right now. I'm very concerned about people. I did see a lot of people come together during the shooting over at Vegas. I think that's a really beautiful thing. But if it takes a crisis for people to get it together and be kind to each other, then that's something you need to look at as well, right?
Well, one of the things that bothers me the most about, if I'm going to get personal, I'd say that the thing that bothers me the most about the current state of affairs is war is untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
No matter who we elect, no matter who runs for office, no matter how much we protest, no matter how much we know that it's a racket, the war must go on. And the war, ladies and gentlemen, the perpetuation of endless war, the aggressive wars in the Middle East, the potential wars all over the planet, and God forbid, the war that they're trying to create with Russia, this perpetual system of war could destroy our entire species if it isn't held in check. This is the last remaining threat, I believe, to the change that we need in our world, is that they have a stranglehold on the concept of war. People can't imagine living without it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have yet to see a populist political candidate from any party get elected to office and stop the war.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be a number one priority for Americans, for people who vote. If you don't vote, that's fine. I understand why you don't vote. But, as a secondary objective, for people who do, please watch for populist candidates who are critical of the wars, because the endless war has got to stop.
Mm-hmm. That's well said. I agree. Yep. And I don't know if we'll see it in our lifetime. It'd be very interesting to see what happens another 10, 15, 20, 30 years, I guess, in the illusion of space and time. So, we're just about out of time in the illusion of, as I just touched on. So, once again, if anybody wants to contact you, what's the best way to do that, Jason? Your new website?
Well, if you want to contact me, I'm on Facebook.
Okay.
It's Jason Jarrell. Last name is Jarrell. The website is paradigmcollision.com. And we're still in the early phases of building our website, but we're going to be adding a lot more to it over the next few months.
Excellent.
And the book is called Ages of the Giants, A Cultural History of the Tall Ones in Prehistoric North America, and it should be available very soon.
Wonderful. I'm so excited to read that. I can't wait. That's going to be great. Congratulations. I know you've worked very hard on that book, you and Sarah both, so congratulations. It's going to be awesome.
Well, we actually completed it more than once and scrapped it.
Gosh, wow!
Because in the beginning, the first time that the book was finished, I looked at it and I realized that it would be impenetrable to a person who didn't live and breathe archaeology like I do. So it needed some changes.
Well, you're very intelligent, and I appreciate that. I appreciate your intellect and who you are. So thank you. Don't change your colors too much, okay? Because we like that. We like that enlightenment and evolution. It's something you need right now. But I wanted to thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's always a pleasure to have you on. And, of course, you're welcome to be my co-host anytime you want to. So you just let me know. And we'll get you back on again at some point in the continuum as well. Stellar information tonight, Jason, I must say. So.
Well, I hope so. I hope that people find it useful.
It certainly is. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight and everybody in the chat room there. Stay tuned for Shining Side Out with David Dungeon Mickey coming up next to sail you on into the night down under, as they always do with their fantastic show. Not sure what they're talking about tonight, but it must be something to do with dimensional travelers. That's what they did last week. All right, everybody, have a wonderful weekend. Be safe out there. And until next time, thank you again, Jason.
Thank you.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this message.
Most guys freeze. That's your cerebral cortex looking for an answer it doesn't have.
See? Even your brain knows you're screwed.
The body's filling with adrenaline right now, whether you know it or not. Your heart's beating fast. It's getting a little harder to breathe. The neurobiological system is telling it to run, but your knees are too weak to move.
Fear is not real. The only place that fear can exist is in our thoughts of the future. It is a product of our imagination, causing us to fear things that do not at present and may not ever exist. That is near insanity. Do not misunderstand me. Danger is very real, but fear is a choice. We are all telling ourselves a story.
You're listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. 100% listener-supported radio. Reporting to danger, unafraid. Right here, where information never sleeps. Revolution Radio. Is your data safe? Do you have the necessary information to assist you in confidently living through just about any survival situation? Is survival and gardening, off-grid living, medical knowledge, or even natural or man-made EMPs on your list of personal concerns? Do you have your documents and your personal information in a safe place in your hands where you know where it is? Well, check out our preloaded EMP-proof thumb drive. Over 3 gigs of survival documents and how-tos, plus the USDA offline food preservation website, and much, much more, including a surprise bonus we just can't tell you about here. With plenty of room left over to store your most important documents.